Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's my honor to introduce our guest for the evening, Dr. Ramesh Hariharan. He has played many roles in his life. He has been into academia, he's founded companies, and currently he's the CEO and co founder for Strand Life Sciences. Welcome to the show, Dr. Ramesh.
Thank you very much, Rishi. Pleasure to be here.
So the topic for today is thought leadership in healthcare. So I thought, considering you've played so many different roles, in the world of healthcare as also otherwise, I thought you'd be the best person to have this freewheeling chat with. And what better context than COVID to really talk about leadership? Because in some way, this came totally unexpected, and people were forced into situations where they had to display thought leadership and try to, on one hand, sustain business continuity and operations, but also to wear their thinking hat and create opportunities out of the chaos and the crisis. So let's start off with what have been some of your experiences of coping up, as well as really doing well in the last 1.5 years that COVID has been around.
Oh yeah, thank you, Sir Rishi. Obviously, COVID uh, was a very unusual step for mankind. I mean, not that we were all prepared for it, and it had implications that are several positive, several negative, and we all had to react. And of course, it helped that everybody had to react rather than just a few people. So that, of course, made it easier. Now, in particular, that what we had to do, if you look at the scenario in March of February, March of 2020, was a very sharp. I mean, it was building up from January, but then the sudden and very sharp hit, that the everybody getting to a lockdown mode March 22nd, absolute decline in all but absolute essential economy from March, April, May, and then you have your business to take care of. And we, in particular, run two sorts of businesses. I mean, which is what a genomics company would. We have labs where sequencing is done, and then we have all the informatics and all the computer software knowledge world where all of that is assimilated. And the labs had to be kept running in the midst of all of this, which meant special arrangements, which meant COVID protocols in the labs, which meant getting over fear and getting over the broad fear perception, getting samples shipped from wherever they are, a lot of logistical sort of improvements, innovations, getting the people to be ferried to the lab and back. And it's not that we did all of that in the best possible way. I think we stuttered and stammered through it a little bit, but eventually figured out how to do that. And all kudos to the people in the lab for fighting it through. And that was one. The second, of course, as I said, the informatics and the knowledge folks. Suddenly, we were all working from offices, and offices were laid bare all of a sudden, with an uncertain future on when that would come back. And so we vacated our offices, people moved back to their homes. And very interestingly, that worked out beautifully, in the sense we have people working from all over the country, from Haridwar, Kanyakumari, Ranchi, and systems got in place very quickly. And that was just amazing to see. And I think going forward, we need to keep some elements of that preserved, even as we come back to offices. I mean, the third element obviously was the economics of the whole lot. You plan your economics in a certain way, and suddenly you see that you've got your bottom wiped out a little bit. So that was the tough part. I think we had to take some decisions to manage salaries and all of that in a certain way. We had to divest some businesses, all of which we did all of these in quick succession. You can imagine a 3-month period where you're vacating offices, getting everybody online, divesting a business, managing salaries, getting the lab up and running. And the beautiful, and top it all, COVID was obviously uh, presented a strong need for testing, and so getting the testing up, getting it going, getting the government permissions, getting, I mean, it just so it was an intense 3 or 4 months, and I think that the steps taken there, typically you would take these steps over a period of time, but when you take them very intensely and very deliberately, I think there's a certain level of efficiency and effect that it has, that we all learned how to do. I think that's a big learning from there.
No, absolutely. I think this was a time for about 3 to 4 months where people were taking big decisions maybe every 5 minutes, as opposed
Yes,
to taking one big decision every month. So the
correct.
pace at which people had to take calls and then
Hmm.
hope the calls would sort of work out right,
Hmm.
was absolutely amazing.
Yes.
So, what do you think, in your experience, were the ways in which organizations manage people's and their anxieties and their expectations? Because while you're thinking of it from the business point of view, the employee is thinking about himself or herself and what the future would be, like. So, what
Yeah.
was the kind of leadership displayed from that point of view?
Yeah. So the first part of the leadership was, not very good, but fact that here you have employees, considerable amount of salary controls and cuts going on to manage the sudden drop in, so the first 3 4 months was, I would say, everybody just had to pitch in to figure out how to get through the process and not worry too much about their aspirations for the future and stuff like that. So that's and working with people to do that, and obviously everybody understands and people all rally around you if you explain it the right way, and so that was a big part of it. As we progressed, the second big part of it was, of course, to keep the labs going, the people secure and safe, and the transport arranged and all of that, so that the lab employees don't feel like, I mean, the rest of the company is sitting working from home in the relative safety and security of their homes, not moving around, but somebody has to do the hard work, somebody has to be on the ground, and
Right.
ensuring that that happens. Then for people working from homes, it's gone through phases, right? Initially it was probably very enjoyable to not sit in traffic for a couple of hours every day. Then people realized that the systems to communicate need to be a little better, but that sort of sorted itself out very quickly. Over a period of time, it did lead to certain amounts of boredom. So you start doing um, various activities to to manage that. And that just as we were starting to say, okay, we should probably start meeting more often physically, then the second wave came up and pushed all of that back. So I think uh, reacting to each of these things, making sure businesses run, and for all, to all credit to everybody at my all my colleagues, the business only after the initial hit of 2 or 3 months just kept getting better and better and better in spite of all of these things, and it's doing better than it was prior to the pandemic, far better. So it's I guess it somewhere shows that people rally around and get things going, and then everything is possible in some sense if we are willing to re-examine some of our biases and tenets.
So when you spoke about business, bouncing back and now doing better than pre-COVID, there are two aspects to it, right? One is the non-COVID business, as it were, last year before COVID came, has sort of restored. And the other aspect of it is, were you able to leverage on COVID and create streams of revenue or business which were coming out of COVID and the necessities that COVID created? Was that something that you could manage to do?
Well, so it is just coincidental that um, the stream of work that we do, and a lot of modern genomics is about data and analytics and informatics and software. And as COVID hit and people realized that physical moving around and economies that are based on that will obviously take a breather, and that investment started flowing into things that could be done remotely, could be done virtually, and so obviously informatics became a um, big investment point for people, and that naturally saw our we didn't have to do anything deliberately. It just automatically, people sitting at home from Ranchi and Haridwar and Kanyakumari, etc. It's uh, that business just went, kept growing stronger and stronger through the pandemic. So that was complete coincidence, but speaks to the fact that going forward, future healthcare businesses are going to have a strong element of data and virtual analytics and all of that. Um, Now, as far as uh, looking at other revenue lines, honestly, we did not do as good a job as we could in terms of generating new revenue lines. I mean, COVID testing obviously was a nice opportunity that uh, we we were one of the first, I think, in Gurgaon lab way back in March, April of 20. In March, we had sort of got the test up. April, we had got permission to run it, and we were up and running. It was one of the first, and however, we had to divest a business because we knew that it would not be easy to last through the pandemic with that business, and so we ended up pivoting quite a bit to really contribute strongly to COVID. Eventually, we did. We there quite a bit on the COVID front. We're running a clinical trial on that front to see if a certain commonly used drug can reduce hospitalization. And we're doing a fair amount of sequencing at this point to look at strains and look at whether new strains are evolving. What does that surveillance look like? So so all of those were adaptations, but what really helped was the fact that we were so data focused that that automatically pretty much took care of compensated more than for everything else.
Yeah, so I think the fact that as an organization you work in the NGS space would probably have meant that you were in a sweet spot when it came to sequencing and trying to understand the different variants of COVID, whether Delta is prominent in a particular location or some other variant, and so on and so forth.
Yes. So obviously we are all kicking ourselves. If you go back and everybody's analyzed this data, we've looked at it. If you look at January of 2021 and you look at the Delta variant, you'll see late January, you'll see that it's about 0.1% of all the strains. By late February, you can see it going to 1%, so it's grown tenfold. Nobody knows that yet. Um, and then the rest, everybody knows the story after that, March,
Yeah.
April, May. So point being that the signs were visible in January of 2020. February of 2020, late for sure. You could see the tenfold change that was happening. And therefore, alarms could have been raised as early as February. And I guess everybody's realized that now. Um, so as a society, we could have done a lot better. We could have had, we as a society, as a government, had a more open approach to participation of players in sequencing. I think there was a lot of, in general, with COVID, there's been tight control from the government in terms of who's accredited, so sequencing was not allowed. So even though private labs were doing a lot of RT-PCR, and the samples were sitting right there under their noses, the sequences were right next to the sample, the energy and the ideas were there right behind, besides both of those, but the regulations just did not allow. And it's unfortunate in some sense because the government and we as a society, no individual can predict everything that's going on. You need to let it free
Hmm.
so that somebody or the other amongst the billion will pick up this and
Right.
find it before everybody does. And that didn't happen. But obviously, we've learned, everybody's learned from that. And going forward, hopefully, now there's a lot of sequencing happening. Hopefully, we'll catch things before they blow out.
Okay. And specifically for COVID treatment, do you think precision medicine has a role to play? You mentioned some clinical trials. Does that involve looking at the efficacy of a drug with respect to a certain kind of gene sequence and so on and so forth?
So the one we're doing is not particularly related to the sequence per se. Um,
Mhm.
in general, um, while a lot of work has happened, looking at, does the strain matter? Does the genetic makeup of the human host matter in terms of responses. There are a number of tidbits here and there, but by and large, nothing that is so strongly out in the clinical world. However, I think what is coming up is the fact that perhaps you can get some early warning. We do have a challenge that we don't know whom it becomes severe in and whom it doesn't, and perhaps
Right.
looking at the molecular profiles and monitoring those, you might be able to get a couple of days of early warning on, perhaps this is going to get worse um, rapidly. So to that extent, I think molecular, not necessarily genetic, but molecular profiling, there are proof of concepts that that is possible. And while we have not yet testing it out in the field, that's something that um, COVID is a strange beast. It waxes and it wanes, and at this point, it's
Hmm.
waning to the point that whatever hypotheses we are trying to test out in the field, it's very hard to find patients to figure that out. So
Correct.
you have to time it all right. So right now, luckily, the problem in a way uh, is uh, is under control. At the same time, that also means that opportunities for research and trying out these things are few at this point.
Absolutely. I think everyone in the research field is looking for positive samples, and that sort of become difficult to get by, which from a society perspective is great, but specifically for
Yes.
R&D people who are trying to think through how to be ready for any wave 3 or wave 4,
Hmm.
from that perspective, it brings a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. That's right.
And you mentioned, molecular testing. Now, one silver lining of COVID has been that molecular diagnostics, which was not really well understood or well penetrated in India, has become a household name. And because of QRT-PCR, now we have qPCR machines, in every neighborhood. Do you think that opens up opportunities for molecular diagnostics in a big way? I know it's not sequencing and NGS, because that's still very expensive, but at least from having a qPCR machine and therefore doing tests like that.
Yes. So it's an interesting phenomenon, and we need to see how the world might be a couple of years from now if COVID becomes endemic at a low prevalence level. Um,
Hmm.
the sharp demand will of course come down, but it may be replaced by increasing awareness to test for other sorts of infectious diseases, and we may be testing more. We may be doing a lot more surveillance, and what COVID has taught us is surveillance is important. We've probably not done enough of that because it happens once in a while, but there are at a local level there are phenomena that happen that we disregard. Hospitals have and microbe resistance issues. We don't do enough surveillance on these things to see whether there's things emerging in clusters in places. Those are generally considered, manageable problems at a societal level, I guess. But maybe a lot more attention will go into that, given all the capacity has that's come up. Maybe a lot more attention will go to just looking at all the microbes and the viruses that are around us, just so that we can happily ignore those because most of the time they don't harm us, but once in a while something will come up out of those. So perhaps we as a society will probably be mapping our environment and our microbial environments much more strongly going forward. All this capacity might help, I mean, in that process. And maybe a couple of years from now, we'll be looking at maps constantly saying these are the various species that are evolving all around us, and that'll be an interesting world.
And in fact, because of the qPCR capacity that is now created and which will, very soon be idle as COVID sort of abates and becomes endemic. So the view also is that for several infectious diseases, there might be RT-PCR based tests that will come up, which so far were not prevalent in India because there was no testing capacity. But now with the equipments there, whatever was done in a more qualitative manner with less accurate, maybe immunoassays, could
Yes.
move towards molecular testing and therefore become more quantitative and more accurate.
Yes, so it definitely that capacity will play a role in converting several of the quicker and perhaps quicker and dirtier immunoassays into more rigorous, perhaps our PCR tests. Um, in addition, there's also been a lot of innovation in the world on just collecting sampling itself. So saliva-based kits to collect saliva for the right purposes. Do COVID testing from saliva, because otherwise you have to insert something up your nose or into your throat, and all that is a little more trickier. So all of those also we've seen that interesting things have come out, and so just this whole notion of collecting samples from home, having simple to use collection kits, transferring them to a laboratory, issuing reports within 24 hours, doing molecular testing in the process. I think those are all new paradigms that will survive. And how exactly that economy will be fed post COVID, we need to see. I hope these labs don't, particularly a lot of standalone labs that are largely doing this alone and not a whole lot else. Maybe, hopefully, they'll all figure out ways to, uh, you know, add on and adapt to the post-COVID world. But indeed, that awareness will make everybody look for those opportunities now.
Absolutely, because what one hears is that the life of a qPCR machine is easily 4 to 5 years. So now that people have invested in that
Yes.
machine, they would figure out
Mhm.
ways of using that machine to the end.
Correct.
Absolutely.
Correct. Correct.
And you mentioned informatics and how data played a role, towards the early part of COVID to help your organization grow, because suddenly data became very important. So, in that context, how do you view the digital health mission that Prime Minister has announced? Do you think that is going to change the way healthcare happens in India, or it will be just more of the same and not really fundamentally change much?
Um, I wouldn't be able to say a whole lot at this point. I don't understand it very well yet, but I think at a very 30,000 feet level, uh, I think everything has to be digital, because otherwise you're relying on information that either is stale or is anecdotal or is biased, or you never know what it is. So to the extent that the digital mission can put in infrastructure so that, one, there is connectivity and there is data capture, um, then a lot of economy can be created around it if done well. If you have good connectivity in remote centers, then obviously the experts in cities can connect and provide opinions and diagnoses to remote areas, and that can be an economy in itself. Um, the data that's collected all over um, can be quite valuable. So, for instance, one of the things that people in clinical research of all kinds struggle with is, where do I find patients who fit the bill? And that's because they're all there. We know there's, for example, we know there are 1.5 million cancer patients annually um, registered in India. There are perhaps more that are not, but where are they? If there's a clinical trial going on for a particular type of drug that fits a certain type of patient, where are these patients? So a digital mission that captures all of this data, saying, these are all the cancer patients, so many patients are in this hospital, they've last went to this hospital, now they are in this pin code, whatever. I mean, obviously there are issues of privacy, security, which are standard in every data realm that one has to handle, but there are ways to do that. But once you do that, then just so many applications get enabled. Now, I mentioned too, right, this remote diagnosis and remote opinions and clinical research. There are many others. So um, I don't have enough information on how the government is thinking and how who people who are designing the mission are thinking. But if they were to think how to enable all these applications and build a bedrock, a piece of infrastructure that will enable a lot of new companies and to to start delivering business models on top of this infrastructure, then I think there's a big impact it can have.
Right. So I think the holy grail will be adoption of different ways of going about and doing your daily task in a manner that data trails get created, which are digital in nature. that would require doctors to, for instance, get used to newer ways of doing things, and so on and so forth. So it's all eventually going to hinge on adoption. If the adoption happens and there is data, I'm sure there are enough number of smart data scientists who can slice and dice the data and create a lot of insights, both for the doctors, patients, governments, administrations, and several other bodies that are keeping tab of, let's say, epidemics, and so on and so forth. So that's
Yes,
certainly what
and
happens.
even to get doctors to enter information is not going to happen without people getting innovative. Nobody's going to spend time punching in a lot of information. So
Right.
just the right interfaces, whatever it be, sound, scribbling, converting into
Exactly.
automatic
Yeah.
conversion to
It
digital.
can't be
So there are,
more onerous.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So but there are whole, there's so much scope for innovation there. There are whole companies that can come up in just doing these things and enabling them. If the digital mission is able to invest and take a view that we're going to invest for the next 5 years in building all this infrastructure and supporting companies that contribute to this ecosystem, so
Right.
that thereafter the game changes completely, then there's just so much that can happen.
Correct. I think
Let alone not to speak of
several.
insurance, which needs all of this data to form the right models and see
Right.
how to optimize care and delivery and all of that. All of that can be can be a big impact of this.
Yeah, very valid point. I think what you mentioned about several players will need to play their part in a small way for this whole thing to make sense, right? Someone will have to create a simpler method for doctors to dictate
Yes,
their prescriptions and so on and so
right.
forth, right? So there's a whole ecosystem that will get created, and when that put together is what we're going to change, rather than just having one platform or one health ID.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the platform has to be viewed as a piece of infrastructure which allows access to a number of companies and efforts to plug in with specialized problems, and the platform just has to integrate all of that and say that's the vision that the platform needs to have. That you do your specialized bit, and I'll give you a playing field, an economic playing field, because I put in this infrastructure. So that is what will rev up everything. Let's hope that the government is thinking that way.
Absolutely. I think they did mention that just like in UPI, there were several startups who played a role.
Mhm.
Similarly, in UHI, also it would be the same
Yeah,
way.
correct, correct.
So very valid points. I think I loved my conversation with you. Frankly, I learned a lot in the last half an hour. I'm cognizant of time, and I believe we've run out of time. So we'll have to end this conversation here. But thank you so much for all your inputs and your time, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Rishi, and to the organizers, and it was a pleasure. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.